repeat the
I'll
question.
repeat the questions, yeah.
Thank you.
Quick question. The Roswell crash site itself and the technicians that get the virus and that carried off the court, did they have any families there, or did you find out any information on how did they tell the families of these people that they died?
Yeah, the question was, the people who reportedly died in the crash UFO cases in 1947, what were their families told, or were they even told anything? That, unfortunately, we just don't know. The problem is that the technicians aren't named within the document. It talks about a team of technicians that were sent out to secure the site, and they handled the bodies, and then it was in sort of hours later that they started to fall sick. And it talks about them being put into isolation, and then they tried all they could, but they just died, as I said, of massive hemorrhaging. But the thing about the Cooper documents is that many of them appear to be like summary type reports, which were clearly taking the material from far more lengthy reports. And that makes a great deal of sense, that, for example, if the president or prime minister of any country, gets a daily briefing, from one particular agency on any subject, the briefing might last 10 minutes because he's got to be briefed on so much. And that briefing might be a 3 or 4 page summary of like a 50-page report. And that's the thing we've got. We've got a lot of these summaries which kind of suggests they were being prepared for, people who needed to know what was going on, but also needed to know in a concise, quick fashion. Just give me the facts. I don't need to read the 500-page original report. And I think that makes sense. But in terms of a lot of the names, etc., unfortunately, it doesn't help our case when they're not all listed. So.
Has all of you ever mentioned about viruses, because it was given as a gift after the flood, it was kind of a third time, and then all of the texts are actually limited to 147, I think, known viruses. And has it ever been used in an attempt to overcome these viruses?
Has what ever been used?
Olive leaf. The olive leaf actually.
Oh, has olive leaves ever been used to combat viruses? I don't know anything about that.
They do eliminate 147 infectious viruses.
Oh, okay.
They can't be synthesized, they can't be patented, so it's just like a leaf. But it was given as a gift after the flood, and I tend to think that viruses were kind of initiated at that time, widespread at the time because things were getting such muscle. Yeah. And then the olive leaf was actually medicine that was offered in a lot. And it's still effective today. Even against AIDS, I just didn't know, tuberculosis is really severe, I think most of the viruses. I just didn't know if they ever attempted to use olive leaf about this.
I've not heard that at all in relation to this story, but I mean, what I can say is when you're talking about sort of viruses in general, I mean, the problem with a lot of viruses is that they mutate. It's like the main reason why people have to keep having flu jabs, if you have the flu jab every year, isn't because it wears off. It's just the flu virus constantly mutates. So that's why you have the flu virus. It doesn't stay exactly the same forever. So.
Sorry, olive leaf actually kills the virus with a calcium salt, but it has a cofactor that traces the enzymes when the virus is going to procreate, and it's nailed with the calcium salt. And because the calcium salt absorbs right into the blood, like nothing, right into the protein, but with this cofactor that they couldn't synthesize, it actually just seeks the enzymatic reaction of the virus to connect to the human cell, and it just nails it with the calcium salt, and that's it. It's like it's all on blood, and they die. And even the flu, even the common cold, even mumps, measles, everything, even polio. And it's just been very suppressed or shelved, and it just seems, really strange to a lot of people that have used it wide shelf. Maybe, this is widespread in ways that it's eliminated most viruses.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned polio, because Bob actually has one chapter in his book where in the late 1940s, a doctor in Illinois, he started researching the UFO subject, and he was a doctor, and he began to find that where there'd been sort of waves of UFO activity from 47 to 49, there'd been sudden outbreaks of polio. And these documents have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, and this is why I think Bob's story is important, because although all these documents that Tim Cooper got, they're not verifiable documents. They were supposedly given to him by whistleblower people on the inside. But when you've got like these polio documents in UFOs, which are real, which have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, that's why I think it's worth looking into, because clearly something's going on. But these files talk about how this doctor had plotted from 47 to 49 where there had been large sightings of UFOs, not just one or two, you know, where there had been a deep wave of activity. And suddenly, within sort of a week or so after, there was an outbreak of polio. Now, when I was looking into this, I actually found, I'll bring it to the next meeting so you can see it, an original copy of a Texas newspaper. I forget where it's from now, but it's from July 1952, and it relates to when there was a famous wave of UFO activity in July 52, with sightings all across Washington, D.C. And it's on the front page of the newspaper, you know, it says sources across Washington or something. And then the biggest story next to it, it says, Texas experiences biggest outbreak of polio ever. And so I'll bring it along next time. It's not a photocopy, it's an original. You've got to be careful how you hold it, but it's like a 1952 newspaper. So things like this lead me to think that it's, you know, there is something going on. And these files, which were prepared by the Air Force, were shared with like the Atomic Energy Commission, the CIA, all sorts of people were on the distribution list and looking at the studies that this guy had undertaken, you know, and they were like, well, this is interesting stuff, you know, let's get a scientist or somebody else in to look at it. So.
You know, I read somewhere, it's kind of hush-hush, we're having an epidemic of tuberculosis, which we thought had been stamped out. And I thought maybe it was due to uncontrolled immigration. I don't know, but it could be connected somehow.
Well, you know, sometimes viruses do have a weird way of, you know, surfacing. I mean, for example, there was a massive flu outbreak in 1918, which killed millions. You know, people forget that.
I've seen the concrete pads where they had the tanks.
I mean, it's like in
Fort Lewis.
In London, back in like the 1500s, 1400s, had what was called the Black Death. And I mean, literally, the population of Britain now is only like, it's about 60 million. Back then it was probably about 10 million, you know, all across the country, but it decimated like 60% of the population. And even in London today, you know, if they're digging in old areas of London to make, I don't know, a new office block or whatever, sometimes they go dig really deep down, they find, you know, hundreds of bodies all laid out, skeletons, and then they have to bring in like the recovery teams because they're all people who died of the Black Death. Now, officially speaking, you know, the virus doesn't last that long. You know, when the person dies, it's not going to live on underground. And there's never been an outbreak of Black Death when they found these bodies today. But they often stumble on them, you know, sort of 10 or 15, and people are like, oh yeah, it's from the Black Death.
Well, that travel group in Alaska, which a couple of years ago, they went up and dug up, and everybody's concerned about the whole village apparently was infected, or much of them. About that might still be alive.
Well, again, a lot of it depends on the type of virus. You know, it's sort of like, you know, when you've got something along the lines of a cold, you know, if you're in the same room as somebody else, you can pick it up, you know, because it's airborne. You know, there are other viruses like, you know, somebody mentioned AIDS, like HIV, you know, which is like bloodborne, you know, spread through blood. So a lot of it is dependence, and also, you know, how long the virus can exist for and live for. So you've got a lot of different factors along those lines.
Did you ever read that there was some speculation about the Black Death, that people reported seeing like clouds or gases, and there might have been some alien.
Yeah, well, the question was about the Black Death and whether, at the time of it, strange clouds were seen in the sky. I'm not personally aware of that in that specific instance, but I mean, there are a lot of weird reports where UFOs have been seen entering and leaving clouds. You know, some people have sort of suggested it's camouflage or something like that, or where they're hiding out, but, you know, who knows? I mean, maybe there's something more to it. Maybe they're not just normal clouds, you know. I don't know.
There were stories of people reported in the fields with these lawns or big, and they were spreading some kind of mist. And then from that comes the image of the death, with the big harvesting device on itself. But I don't know. That could be.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to mention, I caught a virus in 2006. Caught my sister came to my door with a fever, and so I picked up this virus. Okay,
she got over it, whatever the problem was. But I went to the doctor and I was a little afraid to be around the little kids in the room and that sort of thing. And I had a high fever and I was dizzy and it was really, really bad. So anyway, they didn't analyze it, which they probably should have. I wish they would have at this point. Because right after that, I went to another doctor because I developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Okay, so I went through that for 6 years in chemo, in and out, and remission, back and forth. And finally, I had to get a stem cell transplant, which I had a perfect match, donor. So I found that was a miracle in itself. But, you know, these viruses, I think, are setting off a lot of things. And could be cancer, maybe. You know, maybe setting off a lot of cancer.
Well, you know, viruses they're unpredictable. They're sort of constantly changing, and that's why, you know, there's battles always on to try and beat them. But of course, the big question is if there are such things as extraterrestrial viruses, you know, could we even find an antidote for them? You know, it's because, you know, if there's no sort of, you know, it's like, for example, very often cures for viruses are found because somebody's immune to them, you know, and then that person's immunity can be used to combat, you know, it in other people. But if nobody's immune to it because it's not even a terrestrial virus, then, you know, the big question is, can we stop it? And that's what things like Michael Crichton's novel, as I said, the Andromeda strain, sort of focus on. You know, not so much identifying it, but what do you do about it? You know. So.
I was real blessed about it because I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do any drugs, I don't do any of that sort of thing, and it just bam, come on to me. But it went away with her. But I couldn't handle it, whatever it was.
It's cellular metabolism. They have something that I can see in cellular metabolism, which tends to do with intensive people. And at that level of cell metabolism, higher than your true cell, then you get that like overgrowth or imbalance, that, you know, maybe cancer or something like that. So it's good to consciously measure it with universal energy on true cells and do it, you know, DNA movement, and build the kind of and continue to frame yourself up on that. As much as you're synthetic and everything, you still have to frame yourself up on your true self and how it's your true self.
I have two questions. When they are taking the organs out of the animals, have they ever thought that they were trying to, like, I mean, it doesn't seem to make sense, but could they be using those for other things? Because if they're collecting those, could they be using them for something else that was for their benefit? You know?
Yeah, the question was with the cattle mutilations, could the mutilations be done for other reasons, with the organs being removed and things like that? Well, you know, I guess if they're being done by extraterrestrials, that's a big question. If they are, or some of them, then obviously they'd be far more in advance of us. Now, certainly today, you know, experiments have been undertaken very successfully where, for example, pig valves are being used in treating heart disease, where people, you know, you obviously have to have these anti-rejection drugs, but, you know, pig valves are being used to replace like a human valve in the heart. So things like that. So in that sense, you can potentially sort of see if you could overcome the rejection angle, you know, of interspecies sort of transplants, if you like. And some people do think that's what's going on with the cattle mutilations, that they're sort of harvesting body parts and sort of creating or trying to boost their own immunity systems, or even sort of create freakish, you know, sort of half human or half alien abominations, if you like, who knows what. But I mean, I guess it's controversial areas, but when you look at what we're doing, you know, in terms of gene splicing today and that kind of thing, and DNA manipulation, you have to wonder, has somebody else got, you know, far more advanced than we have in this particular field, and what are they doing? The best thing we can say for sure about the cattle mutilations is that it's usually the organs that are targeted, internal organs, sex organs, and the tongue, and sometimes the eyes. and they seem to be sort of removed. You know, it's not like savage tears by like coyotes or wolves or anything like that. Yeah. So something is being either something's been taken and it's being used, or it's being monitored. Now, one of the theories about, you know, is it covert checks by government agencies to determine if there are, you know, emerging viruses in the food chain. And some research was done to show that on the specific parts of the bodies that were mutilated, there were sort of certain parts of the body where you would have a good indication of, or you'd be able to test for a disease to a greater degree. So, you know, whether there's a tie-in there, you know, that somebody was just trying to determine by tagging here, tagging there, if it actually was, you know, the animal was infected in some fashion. But I mean, in that sense, if it is